Shows that it is time for us to get started. I'm filling in tonight for Byron. We'll do something like what he's doing. Word studies is what he's doing. We're going to be a little different, but something like it. Hebrews 3:13. I want us to think about three words. We probably hear them quite often, but looking at this verse, Hebrews 3:13, we find that it says, "But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." The three words I want us to think about, and then we'll look at how sin does some things, are hardness, deceitfulness, and sin. Starting at the reverse end and moving backwards, what is sin? When we say that word, this is one of those, we hear it so often. Do we really think about what the meaning is? We'll often hear somebody define it as missing the mark. Anybody got a better thought about what sin really is, how we ought to define the word as we use it? Okay. Any intentional or unintentional movement away from God and his plan. Failure. Missing the mark fits with that failure one. When you look it up, it is the dictionary, at least on the English Modern Dictionary, only wants to reference the intentional. It is an intentional action against a supreme supernatural being, as they put it. We look at it in Scripture and we go back into the older things, and the idea of intentional or unintentional is very important. When we look at Hebrews, we could find that. Is it possible, thinking about sin then for a moment, to violate God's will, God's law, unintentionally? Absolutely. Even sometimes with the knowledge we have of it, can we do it without knowing we've done it? Yes, there are things we can do. There are offenses we can create against somebody unintentionally. How do you solve that sin? Well, if it's ever pointed out to you, you treat it the way we'll talk about intentional for a moment. But how many of us in our prayers and in public prayer especially do you often hear, "Forgive us of those sins we may not know about"? Because we can do it unintentionally. That takes care of those. Now, when it becomes something we have knowledge, how do you handle an intentional sin, an intentional breaking of God's law? Let's take it out of God's law for a moment and ask it this way. How do you handle an intentional breaking of the law of the state of Alabama? Fine or penalty. Quite often, if the most common one we can all probably reference is one in our vehicle, either going too fast, parking in the wrong place, something like that. We get a traffic violation. That is the breaking of the law, isn't it? How do we handle that? Well, we go down and we plead on it, and depending on what our driving record is, sometimes we can get it thrown out or deferred, or we pay the ticket and admit we've done it, and we take care of the issue, don't we? How do you do that with God and with other men? Well, if you know the other person, let's say you've had a sin and it's with another person, let's say it involves money. You somehow took $20 from them. If I was to use the Bible as a whole and just generally say, how would I make the sin of having taken $20 from someone right? What would I need to do? I'd have to repay that money. That's the first step. I'm partially there. What else do I got to do? Ask for forgiveness. So that's an admission to them I did it, and an admission to who else? To God. So I got to ask for the forgiveness. If I took Scripture as a whole, there's one more piece missing. When I repaid it, how much would I repay? The amount plus a fifth. When you go look at the Old Testament, and it talked about, and the New Testament doesn't bring this about. I'm only putting this as a picture of what repentance has looked like within Scripture for a moment. When we think about sin, if you stole a man's ox and couldn't return it directly, you had to give the cost of the ox plus a fifth part, 20%, because you were making it right. Now, do I think that applies to all sins in the New Testament? I'm not saying that. I'm saying the kind of attitude we need. How do you make it right? You have to correct it, and truthfully, you try to overcorrect it. No, you try to make it better than it was before. That's not always easy, because what are most sins nowadays? Most of us aren't going to go take $20 from each other, are we? What is the most common sin amongst us as brethren in the church? What do you think it might be? You can't get it wrong. It's an opinion question. Huh? Lying, that's probably one of the big ones. Is it possible to lie to somebody unintentionally? Some people try to classify it that way. We have to think about what a lie is. This goes with what a sin was. A sin could be intentional or unintentional. A lie is always intentional. Now, can I give you misinformation? You know, if somebody were to call me yesterday and ask if we were having class inside the auditorium today, based on what I knew at 4 o'clock when I came by the building yesterday afternoon, I would tell you, no, we're not, because it was very warm in here because the air conditioners weren't working yet. Fortunately, James came down here and the AC guy showed up and they got them fixed today, and so we're cooling down a little bit. But I would have told you, no, we're not. And then you would have showed up this evening and we're sitting in here and you would have said, you lied to me. I didn't lie. I gave you an answer based on what? Facts of the moment. Are they still the same facts? No, that's not a lie. Now, if I told you how to get somewhere, and I told you the exact opposite directions on purpose because, you know, we're going out for, let's say it's for college, we're trying for the same scholarship, you and I, Isaac. You ask me how to get down there to UAB to a certain building, and I tell you to get off at 6th Avenue and turn right. What have I just done? For all you know, I intentionally have you turn and go out into neighborhoods you don't need to go out into, but for one purpose. If we're trying for the same scholarship, why might I do that? You don't show up, and then I don't have to worry about competing against him. I didn't beat him out. He just wasn't there. How strange. And then later on, you're like, how strange. And I'm like, what? You could have done it. You go right, and then you have to take 2 more rights, and you come back into town. But I didn't tell you that part, did I? See, that becomes a lie if I did it intentionally. What about if I told you how to go down and get off at University Avenue, take the left, and then take an immediate right to go park in the parking lot out by the baseball fields? But when you got down there, they happen to be doing that one day a year when they actually do some true street maintenance and they have that street closed. Did I lie to you? No, now we're back into that range of I went by how I would usually get there. Because they've closed the road, I can't control that. So we see the idea. There is sin can be intentional, unintentional, but something called a lie, always an intentional thing. What is the purpose of a lie? Which is actually one of the next words I wanted to discuss. Sin. What is deceitfulness? What is deceit? Deceit's really another word for lie. It's for what? I think you had the idea too. Yeah, deceive. What is a lie doing with words? This is where a lie is a deceit, but all deceit is not a lie, because a deceit is a much broader answer. A lie is a deceit that is made with what? Words, usually. Can it be done with actions? Yeah. Deceit is the same thing. The best example of deceit I can think of is from the Bible. Case of Ananias and Sapphira. You remember what happened there in Acts chapter 5? They went out because they saw people bringing the proceeds of selling land, laying it at the apostles' feet for the church to be able to use. And they saw how people thought that was so great, and the honor and the platitudes that they all got from that. And so they decided they wanted to partake in that. They're going to go out and sell a piece of land. No problem with that, is it? Their choice. What did they do, though? Well, let's say they went out and sold the land for $1,500. They came in and laid $1,000 at Peter's feet. Ananias, when he didn't say a word. But what did Ananias, how did he deceive everyone that was watching? And in fact, Peter tells him, you're trying to lie to the Holy Spirit. Because instead of coming in with whatever it was he wanted to give and saying, here's part of what we sold our land for, we want to give, some of it, a large portion of it, whatever words you want to use, to the church, he just laid the sum at the apostles' feet and let everyone do what? Think it was everything they got for it. In the meantime, he had taken 500, put it in his back pocket. He died for that. What did his wife do? Because she was party to it. She knew he'd sold the land. She knew for how much he'd sold the land, and she knew how much he was laying at the apostles' feet. She got asked the same question, and she's the one that literally lied, because she said, yes, that much. And she died for it. Deceit, that whole idea. You didn't have to say the words throughout of it. What happened? People were... And if Peter hadn't been inspired by the Holy Spirit and asked them about it, what would people have all along and still today thought? That they had given it all. They would have been deceived. That's deceitfulness. That's how sin really works. And so we'll think about that a little bit more in a moment with it. This whole idea of lying, deceitfulness. What is hardened? The idea of hardened. Yeah, we come to that stage today. We become desensitized to it. Why do they keep putting those kind of commercials on, nowadays, where you have people of the same sex giving a little peck on the cheek in the background of a commercial that it has nothing to do with it? Why do they put that there? Normalize it. They're trying to desensitize us. It becomes something you see every day. That's one form of hardening. What's another form of hardening? When we truthfully, willfully do what? Think about Pharaoh. What did Pharaoh have happen? He hardened his heart. How did he harden his heart? When you can ask, who is God, that gives you an idea. He wasn't going to do whatever it was Moses asked for. Why? Because it's what Moses was asking for. You're not going to get anything you want, not from the Pharaoh. Hardened his heart. The references, as we think about what's being talked about in Hebrews, you go down in that same passage we were looking at to verse 15. It says, while it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. It's referring back to the Exodus. What did the Israelites do during the time, especially the early time of the Exodus? Now, remember, Pharaoh had done it throughout during the whole 10 plagues. What had the 10 plagues actually done with Israel's hearts? Started to soften them, make them want to follow God. When they see the Red Sea, what should their hearts have become? Soft or even, wanting to follow God. Shortly after the Red Sea, when they get to the base of Mount Sinai, at a time when God's providing their food, he is giving the commands to Moses on the mountain, they get to the point down below that here is the hardening of the heart they did. Well, we can't see Moses. He may be gone forever. We can't see God. Aaron, here, take this gold and make us a God we can worship. They began to rebel. What did they do throughout the Exodus? You think about that whole 40 years of wandering. You know, you had a group of people. God's feeding you every day. The only thing you have to do, how many of you would like this? You don't have to go to the store. You don't have to pay a dime. You don't have to do anything except for 6 days of the week, get out and go into your front yard, pick up some of the manna that falls on the ground so you can bake it into cakes and other things during the day. And you have food to all you want to eat if you eat it within that day. And then on that one day a week, Friday in their case, they would gather for 2 days because you couldn't gather any on the Sabbath day. Would you get hard enough of a heart to say, well, I don't like that. I'd like some onions and some leeks and some cucumbers, you know. I think this light bread just not enough for me. It's a version of hardening the heart, isn't it? That's part of their rebellion. How far does it eventually go? When they get to the base of Israel, it takes about 2 years for them to get from Egypt to there. But you think about moving 2 million people, that's not that strange of a feat. They send in the 12 spies, you remember. The spies come back, and what do 2 of them say? Let's gather up, let's go, it's ours. What do 10 of them say? Oh, we can't do it, there's no way. And Israel listened to him, they rebelled. You know what Israel then tried to do after God said, fine, you don't want to listen to me and do it my way, you can wander around for 38 more years. Those of you that are over the age of 20 can die. Once you're dead, we'll go into the land and we'll take it. What'd they try to do? We're going to go take it on our own. We're going to go take it anyway. Hardening their heart, as in the rebellion. That's what's being spoken of there, that whole period of time. And so you see the picture. So now thinking back to verse 13, when it says, hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. What had happened to those Israelites over that 400-year period that they were in Egypt? They were oppressed for a good part of it. They had a great time in the early part when Joseph was alive, but they were oppressed. But they got so used to it that they were willing to what? Go back to it. Sin, the way it's often been defined sometimes, sin will take you, or sin will cost you more than you want to pay. It'll take you farther than you want to go, and it'll keep you longer than you want to stay. What happened to the Israelites? When they got to the foot of Mount Sinai, did they pay more than they ever thought they would have to? Did they go farther than they ever thought they needed to? And they stayed so long that Moses was able to finish his 40-day conversation with God, and hears them partying as he comes off the top of the mountain. And when you think about that next 40 years, did it take them and cost them more than they wanted to pay? How many of those people, the day they saw the 10 plagues and in the crossing of the Red Sea, the thunderings on Mount Sinai, really wanted to go to the promised land? That 21-year-old young man, I'm going to the promised land. Yet by the end of a short period of time, no longer, we'll just use his age at 21, no longer than 2 years later, by 23, what has he just heard? You don't get to go. What did it cost him? How far did he go? Now he gets to live until he's about 60. If he's 20 and you go 40 years of wandering, he's about 60 years old when he dies. If he didn't die with the fiery serpents or the ground opening up or some of the other major events like that, still died by 60. Do you think he paid more than he wanted, went further than he wanted, and had to stay longer than he ever thought he would? That's the picture of sin. And so when we think about this being hardened and having the deceitfulness of sin, how does sin get in usually? Think about that. Sin and how it comes in. Moses, if we went over to chapter 11 here in Hebrews, Moses is talked about in it. He would rather suffer affliction than the passing pleasures of sin. What does that mean? Is sin often pleasurable? At least from the way we define pleasure? Yeah, it seems like it. What often do we find out about this pleasure later? It's what? Leads to pain. That pleasure doesn't last usually. That's one of the big keys. It's passing pleasures. But sin does that. It makes it look what? You know, what's the one that as teenagers we often fall for and we often try to use the excuse of? Well, everybody else is doing it. That's supposed to make it right. You know, that's what I heard when I was younger too. If everybody was jumping off the bridge, would you? Well, which bridge? I was stupid enough to ask that once. Only once do you do that. I thought I was being smart because there was one bridge up on the river near the house that you could go jump off into the river. It was completely safe to do. If everybody else is jumping off of it, I'll do it. Yeah, we've done it before. But no, most of us understand the picture. Just because everybody else is jumping off a cliff or off of a bridge does not make it where you're what? You're going to. In fact, most of us are smart enough to know that's probably not exactly what I want to do. And that's the picture. But how does sin work? Well, it makes it look like something fun. I don't know why people, these bungee things nowadays, where you go up on a tower and jump off, or they put you in that thing and pull you, they call it a slingshot, I think, and shoot you up. And I don't understand why people do that. But somewhere there's an adrenaline rush or something that makes it seem what to them? Pleasurable. And it's pleasurable until the day that that bungee cord is 3 inches too long, and then what is it? Painful. And by the way, you can ask some of the people that have done it. If you need your back stretched out, it might be real good. They say it can pop everything from the ankles to the neck all at once. Again, I don't see doing it, but there are people who will do that. What does sin do with us? You know, take some of it. Alcohol. What does alcohol and the way it's sold in this country, what does it try to make it look like it is? A good time. It's very pleasurable. You know, this is one of those things, you spend enough time in the military. No, my roommate did not seem very pleasurable the next morning after he did it the one night. It was anything but pleasurable for him, and I left the room because it wasn't pleasurable for me. This is the idea of what sin does. What did it look like the night before when he was out doing whatever it was? He thought it was a great time. It's full of fun. It's pleasurable. The next morning, what does he say? You know the worst problem about sin? It was such a fun time, we're willing to go through whatever it was that next morning. And then by Friday night, what was he ready to go do again? All over again. Here is the picture of how sin works. And it's very deceitful because of that. What happens, thinking about one more, the person who takes drugs, meth. It looks like it's what? Pleasurable. It's deceitful, though, because what is it going to do to a person? Anything but be pleasure. In fact, it leads to the next part. Sin comes in with this deceit, and then it enslaves us. Think about especially, well, using the two, alcohol and drugs. What do people become on a lot of those a lot of times without realizing it? Dependent, addicted. And we'll say, oh, drugs are very much that way, but people don't do that with alcohol unless they're alcoholics. If you get to the point in your life that it takes a drink for you to slow down and go to sleep, you have become what? Dependent, which is addicted. We just accept that because it's a social norm. You don't think people don't do that. Michael Jackson, as great a singer as he was, did it with drugs in a way, and he did it with the help of a doctor. What did he want to have a personal doctor, and what did he do for him in the evenings? He would give him the same stuff you use when you go into surgery for him to go to sleep. And in the next day, he would give him stuff to help him be alert. And then by that evening, he would give him the same stuff to go to sleep. You know what killed him eventually? That's the picture. That's how sin enslaves, because we get to the point, well, I can't get by without. Do we do that with some things? Coffee can be that way. How many of us have to have a cup of coffee when we get up? It's a way to do it. Our body becomes what? Physically accustomed to it. Now, not all of that's bad, but it's something to watch in our lives. That's what sin wants to do with us, whatever sin it is. Why do we have so many people that want to partake, for example, of premarital sex? Because it's pleasurable. And they're willing to take the risk on it because guess what our government has done? If you happen, young ladies, to get pregnant from it, just go down and have an abortion and then go right back into whatever it was you want to do. Because it's your body, it's your choice. Well, yeah, make the choice beforehand. Why take the risk? Well, what have they been? They've been deceived. Sin has made it look really good. And when they become hard enough, what do we begin to do? Think about that. What will sin do eventually? Thinking about it from scriptures for a moment. I didn't hit most of the scriptures as we talk there. Look at Matthew 13. Let's go there. Matthew 13, down at about verse 22. Thinking about the deceitfulness part again for a moment. In verse 22, says, "Now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful." You remember the whole parable there. The sower goes out, spreads the seed. Some of it falls onto good ground, some of it on rocky, some of it into the hardened wayside, and some of it amongst the thorns. This is what it's talking about. What are some of the thorns we face? The deceitfulness of riches. What do we all think's going to happen if we have just a little bit more money? If I had just a little bit more money. And when you have a little bit more money, what's the next phrase that comes out? Oh, if I just had a little bit more money. And then Bidenflation happens, and that's a whole nother story. But if I just had a little bit more money. And that's the deceitfulness of riches, because what will riches gain us in the long, long run? Nothing, because where'd they come from? Even if it's not the dollar bills we stuff in our pocket, let's say you have actual gold in your hand. How much will gold be worth on the day of judgment? Nothing, because it won't be there. It's an element. It's going to return from whence it came. That's the point. But what does it deceive us? We all want a little bit more of it, don't we? You know, we feel that pain. You got to pay for kids going to college. You got to pay for the braces. You got to pay for this. You got to pay for that. You got to have a car. You got to have, and nowadays you got to have gas. You better be willing to take out a major loan. This is the picture of what we go through, but there's a deceitfulness around it that sin wants to use. We think that riches gives us something and that we're going to get something from of it. So we see a picture there. Look at how it enslaves. Let's go to John chapter 8. John chapter 8, down about verse 34, I think it is. Yeah, 34. We don't like to hear it phrased this way, but think about how Jesus said it. Jesus answered them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin." Now, do you think in this case he was talking about the unintentional sin that might come up here and there? No, he's not even talking about the accidental sin, because is it possible for us to accidentally do something? Sure, and we need to correct that and not try not to do it again. What's he really talking about when he says, Whoever commits sin, there's an intentional choice right there. We understand that, don't we? Those of us who have wives or husbands or significant others, if you do something that you know the other person is infuriated by, what have you done? You know, there might be sin involved, but you've made them angry. By the way, what does it do to God when we sin, go against his will, his law? It makes him angry. He's in that same mode. It's bad enough if you do it unintentionally. All of us, when you went through that newlywed phase, what's one of the first things you start finding out? Oh, I didn't know they chewed their fingernails at the dinner table. Oh, what are you spreading on that bread? What do you mean you have to have 3 blankets on the bed? Stuff you didn't know about until when? You got shoved in one room together, and all of a sudden, all these things come out. It can be infuriating, and it's bad enough when you didn't know it. When all of a sudden you know that the thing that drives her crazy, I'll use it that way I can be me, that drives her crazier than anything is if you leave the light on in a room you're not using. You leave the light on, and you leave it on all day long, and you don't even think about turning it off when you come to bed. What are you really doing? Especially when you know that's going to drive the other person crazy. Or maybe it's the throwing the socks on the floor. Or maybe it's the not scraping your plate off when you go to the kitchen after dinner. Or we could go through a number of things. You know what I'm talking about. Even as a young person, we understand that with our parents. Do your parents have a pet peeve they want you to take care of? Camilla, Isaac, Logan probably remembers. He's not far removed from that. They have things they want you to do, and you know you can drive them crazy by doing what? Just doing it halfway or not doing it at all and just walking away from it. And what's it look like when we make that choice? That's exactly what sin begins to do. Because when we make the choice, what are we saying? We don't care about what you care about, oh one who I love. I want to throw my socks on the floor. She has told you the one thing I ask is, please don't throw the socks on the floor. Put them over here. She has asked you, given you a way out of it, and if you throw the socks, there's that word again. What is a slock? Anybody know? You throw that sock on the floor, in the middle of the living room floor even, because you sat down on the couch to take your shoes off. You just throw them in the middle of the living room floor when you know she has asked you, told you, what are you doing? You're literally rebelling against her. When we know and intentionally commit sin, what are we doing? Anybody ever thought about standing down, God up above you, and looking up and saying, I don't care what you say, I'm doing it the way I want? You say, I would never do that. You find the one thing in your life when you've made the actual choice to do it, and whether you stand there and do those words and shake the finger at him or not, what have you done? And that's where sin leads us, and that's where the hardening becomes. Now think about that. Sin blinds us to it. What's the greatest example of the blinding nature of sin? The one that's easiest to see in Scripture, it's the first. You go all the way back to Genesis 3. What was it that Satan, in the form of the serpent, did with Eve? Oh, Eve, hasn't God told you you can eat of any of the trees? And Eve says, well, any but that one in the middle, we're not supposed to even touch it, even though God didn't say that. You notice he's now seen where Eve's weakness is. Eve has gotten to the point, not only can we not eat of it, we can't even touch it. And Satan goes, oh, well, you know, the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and You'll be as smart as gods, and you will not surely die. You see, what was the restraining thing on Adam and Eve? Don't eat of that tree. In the day you do, you will what? Surely die. Now somebody says, well, they didn't die that day. Death happened though, didn't it? Spiritually, the moment they ate of the tree, what were they? Dead. How did God take care of that death? Some died because Adam and Eve were given coats to wear. Where did those coats of skins come from? Animals that were alive were no longer what? First animal sacrifice is there. Something died that day in Adam and Eve's place for them to continue physically living. And then they had to try to make it right with God by following what he said. Did it totally work? We'll take a look at Cain and Abel. You know, what's Cain? Cain's another great example of this, sin blinding you. Well, Cain, if you will make these offerings in this manner, you'll be pleasing to God. Now, I don't know, the scriptures are not totally clear whether it was Cain was supposed to bring an animal sacrifice and make, or if he could bring the fruit of the land. It doesn't tell us that. It just says his sacrifice was not made how? In faith. So somewhere along the line, he didn't believe what God told him, whether it was by the choice of what was sacrificed or how it was sacrificed or a combination of the two. We don't get all the details. What do we know? His sacrifice was not pleasing to God. And God took him to task on it and said, your brother Abel is doing it exactly right. Therefore, I know I gave you good enough instruction. What was Cain's answer to that? Instead of saying, well, maybe I ought to take some of these fruits and vegetables and go over to Abel and get a sheep if it happens to be that it had to be an animal, or maybe I need to change how I'm doing it, or this or that and the other. What was Cain's answer to it? Blinded by deceitfulness of sin here. You know what I'll do? If I take Abel out of the way, God won't have anything to compare me to, and guess what? I will have to be. Isn't that how Cain did it? Kill his brother. God, you've got to accept it now. I don't know what you're comparing me against. How many people try that in their lives today? Because they've been deceived by what? Sin. This is all right for me. And it begins to harden their heart. We read about that back in the back. Remember Israel. One sin led to another, didn't it? The first complaints they had were, you've led us out here into the wilderness and they're going to overtake us. And God does what? Separates the Red Sea. They get across the Red Sea. You've led us out here and we don't have anything to drink. God brings forth water from a rock enough to water 2 million people plus all their animals and everything else. Then this light bread's not good enough. We need the leeks and the onions and the cucumbers. Oh, and then we don't have any meat, and God gave them enough quail to the point that it was coming out their nose. It said, in other words, you had more than enough to eat. You had so much to eat it made you sick, and they still what? Complained. Think about you. Matt, how would you feel if over a course of 40 years, you never had to buy a pair of jeans, a shirt, or shoes? Wouldn't it be great? You go down to wherever it is you buy your clothes one time, 40 years. Yeah, she might make you get that second shirt out. But think about what God did for the children of Israel over the 40. You ever read the account? And it says over that 40-year period. Now, I'm sure they had to find new shoes for the young people who were growing up. God didn't make that kind of miracle. But your shoes didn't wear out. Your clothing didn't wear out. You had food every day. And you still what? Yeah. There's humanity there. And if they couldn't recognize it, what are we like sometimes? What does sin want to do with us? You see, the biggest sin that gets in the way is that one called pride. What was Israel's problem coming out of Egypt? Everything was about who? Yeah, they would use the term we, but it's all about me. I want. And as a group, we all want, but I want. What was Cain's biggest problem? I want. What was Eve's biggest problem? I think it looks good. I think it'll fill my belly, and I think it'll make me smart. And her biggest problem was thinking, because it led to pride. And that's the biggest sin. You think about even today, what usually leads us into sin's biggest problems? I just need a little more money. And that is our biggest problem. What's the answer to watching out to not being hardened by sin? Go back to Hebrews chapter 3 again for a moment. Hebrews 3, as we finish off this part. Starting at verse 12, there he says, "Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief and departing from the living God." What is another word for an evil heart of unbelief? Because what is it? What do we in the end convince our own heart that we are? Smarter than God. And that's what it does. And he goes on, he says, "But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end." Then he goes into verse 15 there, where we read earlier, "While it is said today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion." And then he gives the example of those Israelites. And at verse 19, he makes it so clear to them. What does this problem of sin lead us to? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Now, think about the case that's being talked about there and apply it to us. These people that he's speaking about had been there for how many of the plagues? Well, since it was all those 20 years and older, and the plagues didn't take a long amount of time, all 10 of them. How many of those same people saw the crossing of the Red Sea? Literally, they participated in it. How many of them saw the thunderings on the mountain? How many of them saw the manna every morning on the ground? How many of them heard God speak? And yet, why is it that they had the issue? They could not enter in because of unbelief. I've often said that faith or belief is more a trust and confidence. Can I believe something, but that belief do me no good? Give me an example of believing something and it doing me no good. Believing in the boogeyman. How does it do me no good? Yeah, if you truly believe in the boogeyman, you take precautions. But what do we all often do? Oh, there's no boogeyman. And then one night, who jumps out of the bushes? And that's the exact picture. It's a good example. The only other one I've often said it, if I heard a logging truck coming over that hill and I'm standing in the middle of the road out there, if I truly believe that if that logging truck hit me, it's going to, at the best, hurt me terribly, most likely kill me, what do? You know what the Israelites of old would have done? That's the picture. That's where we'll stop for tonight.